Today I'm here to talk about birds and plants and backyard habitats. So let's see how this goes. This isn't a talk I give too often. In fact, I just kind of revamped it a little this afternoon. But first we're going to go through a few birds, and then we'll talk about plants. We'll kind of go back and forth, birds and plants, because there's a real connection between a lot of these birds and plants. And there's a reason in your field guides that the birds are often illustrated with plants surrounding them. You should take note of that because you'll often find certain birds, in certain types of plants or ecosystems. Now, we've got two kinds of quail in the area, just to refresh your memory. The one that's in our backyards down here is the Gambel's quail, the one on the right. That's our desert quail. So they like deserty landscapes. And then a little bit further up the hill, a few thousand feet up, typically in the chaparral is where you'll find the California quail. So if you take a trip up to Idlewild, for example, you'll be driving through the California quail habitat, the chaparral. There's a few places where they meet, and one of those places happens to be Palm Springs in the Indian Canyons. So if you live or frequent that area, you could actually see both species on one walk. Because the Californias come down from the mountains, and the Gambel's is there at the low desert, and they meet right there. The California quail is also our state bird, by the way. And here's what the Gambel's quail, they're named after this guy. I know you were dying to know how he got the name. It's spelled G-A-M-B-E-L, by the way. It's not Gamble like the casinos. It's named after William Gamble. I didn't have a picture of him, but I stuck in a picture of a member of the Donner Party. Only because William Gamble also died while crossing the Sierras in winter, but he died of typhoid, not of starvation. And he's one of the few birders, actually, William Gamble, who actually broke the unofficial rule of naming a bird after yourself. He actually did it. Normally, you're supposed to name a bird after somebody else, but never after yourself. But he got so excited to hear that somebody was going to name a bird after him that he actually published a paper about it before that actually happened, and so he was credited with naming it after himself. Anyway, another interesting bird of the area that's connected to plants is the Swainson's hawk, and if I come back and speak in the spring, I might be speaking about spring birds or Swainson's hawk migration, or maybe you've been down to Anza-Borrego to see it. But we get thousands of these Swainson's hawks that funnel through our area every spring. And the reason they stop by has to do with plants. So when we get rain, it produces a lot of brown-eyed primrose. And when we have a lot of brown-eyed primrose, we get a lot of caterpillars. And when we have a lot of caterpillars, the Swainson's hawk stop by to eat them. So there's definitely a connection there. So watch for those guys starting in February and March, especially if we get some rain this winter. Let's hope. And the Swainson's hawk was named after this guy who never actually saw his bird. And that's true of a lot of these people. They never really see the birds that they're named after, except for Gamble. But he ended up becoming the Attorney General in New Zealand. William Swainson did. Swainson's hawk. Now, in the summer, we get white-winged doves, and white-winged doves in Arizona are known for associating with saguaro cactus. Now, saguaros don't grow naturally in the Coachella Valley, but there's been a number of transplanted saguaros that you'll see around town that may flower, and we do have white-winged doves here, and so you may see them sticking their whole face inside the flower and turning their whole face and head yellow with pollen. So they do help pollinate the saguaro cactus. Unfortunately, even if saguaros go to seed here in the Coachella Valley, our temperature and our climate is so hot and so dry, even compared to Arizona's, that they won't germinate here. So all the saguaros that you see around town have been transplanted from Arizona. White-winged doves, by the way, are starting to spend the winter here, so they're not just summer residents anymore. They've decided that, some of them have decided they don't want to migrate anymore. So they're sticking around. Burrowing owls, I just threw this one in there because they're so cute to look at. There's no particular plant association with this one, but they do occur in farming areas, agricultural areas, so that's where you want to look for them. especially at the south end of the Salton Sea, as you know. And some of them migrate and some of them don't. So this is the time of year when the migrating burrowing owls are arriving and joining their year-round resident friends, just like the people. Now, long-eared owls migrate irregularly, so it's kind of hard to predict. One of the benefits of the non-native tamarisk trees is that it is a favorite place for these guys to hang out. So although I don't suggest you plant tamarisk trees, we really need to get rid of them. But if you do frequent tamarisk groves, be on the lookout for the long-eared owl, because that's where you'll find it hanging out. Kind of looks like a great horned owl on a diet. Now, this little owl is associated with coniferous forest and firs, so you'd need to go up to Idlewild. Oops, what happened? Sorry. To find this bird nesting. But in the winter, about this time, they start to come down the hill, and some of them actually will winter in our backyard. So always be on the lookout for a little owl that might be sitting in one of your bushes during the winter. This could be a northern saw-whet owl. I'll be talking more about hummingbirds later, but just to give you a preview, these are the two hummingbirds that are most common in the Coachella Valley. So if you're going to learn just two hummingbirds, learn these two, the costas and the annas. So most of us have plenty of costas in our yards, the one on the left with the purple throat, and you might have a number of annas too, depending on where you live. They're both here, and they're both very common, and they're year-round residents. Now, the costas was actually named after Louis Costa, an Italian. And the Europeans have long been fascinated with our hummingbirds because they don't have anything like this over there in Europe. There are no hummingbirds in the old world. So many of our hummingbirds were collected by Europeans and also named by Europeans, including the Costa's hummingbird. And the next one, the Anna's hummingbird. The Anna's was named by this guy for his wife, Prince Victor Massena named it after his wife. Wasn't that nice of him? And he was from France. Now, in the summer, we get a few of these black-chinned hummingbirds, but they're not common here. They seem to be more common down towards Indio. So if you live at that end of the valley, you might have black-chinned hummingbirds. I'm always interested to hear reports of black-chinned hummingbirds, so if you see them, let me know. Because they're not too common at my house, that's for sure. And in migration, spring and fall, watch for the very aggressive and colorful rufous hummingbird at your feeders. It's hard to mistake this one. It's the only hummingbird around with all that orange, especially on the male. So that's just a migrant. He just passes through for a few weeks, 2 times a year. And, another reason to just keep watching your hummingbird feeders or your flowers is you could get something really crazy showing up, like a broad-billed hummingbird. There have been records of this bird at Big Morongo Preserve and Desert Center, so you never know where it might show up. But normally you need to go to Arizona or down into Mexico to see this species. Very colorful and tropical. Vermilion flycatchers are always a favorite. In fact, they're on the cover of our local birding guide, which you can purchase after the show if you want. And these guys are always near water. So if you live near water, or there's a water feature near where you live, especially if there's some fringing vegetation, like a willow tree or a cottonwood tree or something that hangs over the water, that's the kind of place you'll find the vermilion flycatcher. That's where they nest. They're riparian, water-loving species. Sunnylands is also a good place to see vermilion flycatchers. We lead a lot of bird walks at Sunnylands now, as some of you know, right here in Rancho Mirage. We're still doing our Thursday morning golf cart tours on the estate. We're still doing our free Friday bird walks in the gardens there. And this year they've also added Saturday golf cart tours on the estate. So that's a new thing to watch for. So we're doing tours on Thursdays and Saturdays on the estate. And you can sign up for those online at sunnylands.org. This is one of my favorite local birds, the loggerhead shrike. And this bird, as you may know, is called the butcher bird because it likes to impale its prey on a thorn. And so you'll find him hanging around near thorny bushes. So there's a good reason to have a few thorny bushes in your yard because the shrike may come by and stick something on there. So this is just a small collection of some of his victims. How do you like that? We've got a rufous hummingbird in the lower right, a scarab beetle, a large grasshopper, and another type of beetle on the upper left. So why does he impale his prey? 2 reasons. He's a bird of prey, but he's not a very big bird of prey, and so he needs to let the meat kind of cure a bit. Right? So when he comes back a little bit later, he can take little shrike-sized chunks, and the meat kind of just falls off the bone, you might say. So he hangs it like a butcher. That's why he's called the butcher bird. And the other reason is, to, of course, to impress the females with his hunting skills. So she can come by and review all the things that he's caught and determine if he's a good provider or not. So watch for him and thorny bushes. Now, it turns out in 2000, they discovered that gray vireos were wintering in California. This wasn't known before that, and the reason they discovered it had to do with plants because they have an association with elephant trees down in Mexico. So somebody thought, well, you know, there's some elephant trees in Anza-Borrego. And so they went down there one winter, and sure enough, in the year 2000, they found some gray vireos wintering in those elephant trees in Anza-Borrego Desert State Park. And that's the furthest north wintering spot that we know of, right here in California. The Bell's vireo is another riparian species, like the vermilion flycatcher. So you'll find it where you have cottonwoods and willows and stream sides, places like Big Morongo Preserve. I couldn't find a picture of John Bell, who it's named after, so I put in Alexander Graham Bell. Well, they might be related, you know, John Graham Bell. But anyway, John probably looked kind of like this, and he was Teddy Roosevelt's taxidermy teacher. Kind of neat. And he also hung out with Audubon, so that was a pretty interesting guy. But that's who Bell's vireo was named after. Now, Bell's vireo is a common victim of the brown-headed cowbird, which is a nest parasite. So that's the bird on the right, the cowbird. Now, cowbirds migrate during the day, and they used to follow the bison herds. And these days, there are no bison around, so they follow the cows. And since cows don't go anywhere, the brown-headed cowbirds have become sedentary. They stay put. And so they're wreaking a lot of havoc because they're not moving on like they're supposed to. And so they're laying eggs constantly in other birds' nests, including the poor Bell's vireo here, which is a frequent victim. So the Fish and Wildlife Service sets up these cowbird traps that you see here on the right to help keep cowbird numbers in check. Not to eliminate them, but at least to keep their numbers down, to give these other birds a fighting chance. And it's been working, I'm happy to say. It's been working a lot. So birds are making a comeback, including the Bell's vireo. Now, here's a Bell's vireo nest. Which one is the cowbird? And can you see one of these babies is not like the other? So that cowbird chick there is going to get all the food because it's the biggest target. And the other birds are either going to starve to death or the cowbird's going to shove them out of the nest like a bulldozer. So any way you stack it up, none of those other birds are going to survive, only the cowbird. So that's why we need to, help these other birds out because there's just too many cowbirds in the desert now. They like turf grass, by the way, because they're a bird of the prairies normally. And so normally you wouldn't find a cowbird in a desert, but since we've transformed the desert into a lot of grass, it's kind of like a little prairie, and the cowbirds just love it. If you plant sweet acacia trees, you'll get verdins. I can guarantee it. Now, most of our yards have verdins around them. They're just a very common bird. I bet you they're nesting in these trees right outside here, too. They like mesquites. They like palo verdes, like you see on the lower left. This is a verdin nest, by the way. But they really, really love sweet acacia. That's their #1 favorite tree. And it's a beautiful tree, too. So it's something you might want to add to your yard if you haven't already. Sweet acacia tree. The verdins will appreciate it. So these nests that you've seen in your own backyard, kind of the size of a large grapefruit or a football with a little side entrance, that's the work of the male verdin. And he'll build 3 or 4 nests in a year. So some of those are going to be just sort of bachelor pads or man caves. And one of those nests will be chosen by the female. So he spends a little extra time making that one nice. But the male does all the nest building. Cute little bird, common in your backyard, but easy to overlook. Silky flycatcher family, we have one representative in the area, and that's the Phainopepla, which means shiny cloak in Greek. It's the only bird whose common name and scientific name are one in the same, Phainopepla. And this is the male on the left and the female on the right. And it's a very interesting bird for many reasons. Somebody going to get that? It feeds on mistletoe. So mistletoe is probably not a plant you have in your yard on purpose, but you may have some in the area, and if you do, you'll have Phainopeplas around. They feed on mistletoe berries. They also feed on insects, and they'll even nest in a big clump of mistletoe like the one you see on the right there. So very few birds and very few animals eat mistletoe berries because it's kind of a noxious plant, but not the Phainopepla. They don't seem to be bothered by it. They also have a peculiar migration. Instead of going north-south, some of them travel east-west, and they'll nest in 2 different places in 1 year. So they'll go to the beach during the summer, nest in the coastal mountains, and feed on insects, and then they'll come out to the desert in the winter, about now, they're starting to arrive, and nest a second time in the desert and feed on mistletoe berries. That's a pretty good life, I'd say. So I think I would choose to be a Phainopepla. You get to spend the summer at the beach and the winter here in the desert. Go back and forth. They also create these things called tetrascatas. So I want you to say this word and repeat it, and because this is a word that I made up. But I want it to become part of the vocabulary, and maybe the Oxford English Dictionary will pick up on it one of these days. So spread the news. This is a tetrascata, which is Greek for poop pyramid, which is exactly what it is. It's a pile of Phainopepla poop in the shape of a pyramid. And you will see these around, the areas that you like to hike if you're observant. This particular one, which is my favorite, is over in Joshua Tree. Some of you know this tetrascata. But it's kind of funny, but it's an important part of the ecology, because what happens is under the favorite perch of a male Phainopepla, it's called the banner perch, this pile of poop will build up over time. And inside that tetrascata are viable seeds of mistletoe, which will germinate. So this is how a new mistletoe clump gets spread and started on the different bushes. It starts in the droppings of the Phainopepla. And some research has shown already that the digestion of the seeds by the Phainopepla actually aids in the germination when it comes out the other end. So the Phainopepla's digestive juices are helping to break down the seed coat to further enhance germination of the seeds. So there's a real connection between Phainopeplas and mistletoe. Tetrascata. Note the spelling as well. Okay. Got that? Okay. Leconte's thrasher is a bird of concern around here because it is declining. It's never been that common, but they do occur in the Coachella Valley. They're associated with salt bushes and creosote bushes. So if you do some hiking out in Thousand Palms at the Coachella Valley Preserve and you're hiking around a lot of salt bushes, creosote bushes, that's where you might find the Leconte's thrasher. It's a year-round resident, unlike the Bendire's thrasher, which actually is a migrant. And the Leconte's thrasher is named after this guy, John Lawrence LeConte. His father was also John L. LeConte, and his father's brother also had a son, John L. LeConte. So it's extremely confusing when you read about these John LeConte guys. They're all related, and they all named birds and things after each other. So it was one way they got around the rule of naming birds after yourself. They could just claim they were naming it after their cousin who had the same name. Yeah, pretty sneaky, huh? But one of these LeContes was the president of UC Berkeley. So if you've been up to Berkeley, or maybe you graduated from Berkeley, you may know there's a LeConte Hall in Berkeley. Here's your guy, LeConte's thrasher. We also have California thrasher in the area and wren tits. Now these ones like the chaparral, kind of like the California quail. So you go up a little bit in elevation, up on Highway 74, or up above the Indian Canyons, and you start to get into the realm of the wren tit and the California thrasher. It's a chaparral species. The crystal thrasher, I probably shouldn't have included this photo of it on a juniper, but it actually likes mesquites. Mesquites is where you'll find this one. In fact, on last Saturday's bird walk at the Coachella Valley Wild Bird Center in Indio, they saw a couple crystal thrashers, so that's a really good place to see them. They have a free bird walk there every first Saturday of the month at 8 o'clock. So you just missed it. But you can catch November's on the first Saturday of the month there and see a crystal thrasher with Elizabeth Morgan. These two birds actually nest in cactus. So if you plant cactus or have cactus in your yard, you may get a couple nests appearing from the cactus wren or the black-throated sparrow. Not many birds will actually build a nest in cactus, but these two don't seem to mind the spines. These two colorful species are just beautiful to look at, but they're associated again with the riparian areas, the cottonwoods, the willows, the places like Big Morongo Canyon Preserve, and that's where you'll find summer tanagers and Bullock's Orioles. And a Bullock's Oriole is named after this guy who was a silver speculator, and he caught a Bullock's Oriole down in Mexico on one of his trips in the 1800s, and it eventually was named after him, William Bullock. Now, Orioles like to nest in palms and in yuccas, especially with the Scots Oriole on the right there. And I'll talk a little more about Orioles in a bit. But this is a hooded oriole on the left, nesting in a palm, and a Scots oriole on the right, which likes to nest in Mojave yucca, in the high desert. And they're complete migrants, and that means all members of the species migrate. A partial migrant means some of them migrate and some don't. But a complete migrant means they all migrate. So all of our orioles are complete migrants. And again, there's another nest of a hooded oriole on the right there, tucked up under a palm frond. The Scots Oriole is named after this friendly-looking guy, old Fuss and Feathers, they called him. He was the commanding general of the Mexican-American War. I'll bet you he never even saw a Scots Oriole, even knows what it is, but one of his troops named it after him, probably to get in good with him. He ran for president and lost in 1852. Winfield Scott, Scots Oriole. If you have plants in your yard that produce tiny seeds like thistle, you may attract goldfinches. Now, some of you may be feeding goldfinches with thistle seed that you purchase. That's an easier way to do it. But if you actually plant thistle, then you'll get goldfinches as well. And this is a real prize, this Lawrence's goldfinch. I saw one this weekend. Normally we see the lesser goldfinch, but sometimes the Lawrences will mix in with them. And it was named after this guy here, George Lawrence, who founded the AOU, the American Ornithologists Union, which has recently been renamed, if you didn't get the memo, the AOS, the American Ornithological Society. So the AOU is no more. But he founded it way back when, and he was a pretty important guy in bird history, George Lawrence, Lawrence's goldfinch. Yeah, we just had a hurricane recently, so I threw this in there. But you just never know what might show up in your backyard or flying over your backyard here in the Coachella Valley. That's what makes this place so exciting for bird watching. You could get a magnificent frigate bird or an albatross flying over. We have records of both these birds right here in the Coachella Valley. Now we're going to talk a little more about the habitats in your backyard, and I'll stay around afterwards to answer all your questions too, so be thinking about what you want to ask. But our backyards can serve a very important role in helping to alleviate habitat fragmentation. You know, the desert used to be one continuous, beautiful ecosystem, but now it's all broken up because of us and our needs. And so, again, your backyard can be an important piece of the puzzle to try to link it back up together. And birds are the most likely users of your backyard just because of their mobility. They're not hindered by walls and fences and things like that. So if you do things in your backyard to attract wildlife, you're going to get birds coming to your backyard right away. Now, a couple of local species maybe you've heard of, the Coachella Valley fringe-toed lizard on the lower right and the flat-tailed horned lizard. They're both not doing too well because of this habitat fragmentation. They don't have much space left. Now, they're not going to benefit from your backyard so much, unfortunately, because, like I said, they're not as mobile and can't get over the walls and the fences, but the birds definitely will. And, you know, this is what we've transformed our desert into, you know, something very undesert-like, which might favor cowbirds and house sparrows, but it doesn't necessarily favor the native species that we might want to try to attract. But anyway, these are some typical yards, you know, you see around town. It looks nice for us, but it's not real good for wildlife or for birds in general. Now, if you like house sparrows, starlings, and brown-headed cowbirds, fine. You know, you can put in grass all you want, and that's all you'll get. One of the comments and questions I get more often than not is, you know, I put out all this bird seed and I feed birds or whatnot, but all I get are house sparrows and pigeons and starlings. And when you go to look at the yard, you'll see that it's just very sterile and very plain and not much variety in terms of any native plants at all. So if you plant the right kind of stuff and have the right kind of mix, you'll get the right kind of birds coming. And that's kind of what this talk is all about, trying to let you know how to do it right. This is not what we're teaching at College of the Desert in our arboriculture class. And yet you see this all over town at certain times of the year. This is not the proper way to prune a tree. It's not good for the tree. It's not good for wildlife. It's not really good for anything. And yet we do this, or we allow it to be done in our yards. So stop it. This is not what nature intended, all right? This is not good for the tree. And again, it's not good for wildlife or a bird trying to nest there. Nothing can benefit from that. And yet you still see this stuff, so please help me out here. And palm trees too, we're going to be talking about palms. Do we really need to hack our palms and cut every last little frond off and skin them? Maybe we can leave those skirts and those fronds on the tree. We'll talk about that too. I don't know what's going on here. That's pretty severe over pruning. That was a mesquite tree. And that's a waste of water, too. Come on, we can't afford to waste water like that. Now, you could go plain with your yard and just cover it with gravel like this person did. You know, and that's low maintenance. But again, is there any wildlife benefit to it? Not much. It's almost scores a 0. So what we want is some kind of a balance. Okay, maybe you want low maintenance. You're not here all the time. You're not here all summer. So low maintenance is good, and we want to save water and whatnot, but we also can provide something in the meantime too. So we want to seek a balance between these two extremes. You can certify your habitat. That's kind of a fun little carrot on a stick for you to try to get your yard certified by the National Wildlife Federation. There's a couple other organizations that will certify your yard too. But it really boils down to the food, the water, and the shelter that you provide in your yard. So we'll go through that again. The food, water, and shelter. But you can put a nice little sign out in your yard and let your neighbors and the people walking by know that you're trying to do your part for wildlife. And they'll understand maybe why your yard looks a little different than other yards. Education, right? We're trying to educate the public. So I get people walking by my yard. I got a little sign out there. In fact, that's my sign right there. And I'll watch them from my kitchen window in the morning. They're off for their morning walk, and they'll walk by my yard, and they'll look at my sign, and they'll back up, and they'll read the sign, and then they'll look at my yard, and they'll read the sign. Oh, you can see the light bulb going off in their head, and then they're on their merry way. So they're understanding why there's so much noise, why my yard is just full of birds, why the plants, like in my yard, look a little different than the neighbors. They get it, and the sign kind of helps seal the deal there. So, if you do this kind of thing, you should be proud of what you do and try to educate your neighbors, and it'll rub off on them. I've been in my house for 23 years now. Almost every house on the block now has gone away from the grass and the gravel and the typical stuff. They've gone native in some way. Now, maybe not to my extreme, but every single yard except for one. There's one guy who's still holding out. We're working on him. But everybody over those 23 years has made a change, and I'd like to think I've had something to do with that, because they certainly know me, they know my yard, they see the people coming by, and they want to do something similar to what I'm doing, and I'm happy to help them. Yeah. Yeah, it's not a bad-looking yard. No, you're right, and that's part of it too. You want to show people that having a wildlife-friendly yard doesn't mean it looks bad or looks ugly. In fact, it can look even more beautiful than a yard just filled with grass and gravel. Yeah. So it's not a scary thing, and it actually is fairly low on the maintenance department if you do it right too, and it uses a lot less water. So anyway, it's just a whole bunch of reasons to want to do this kind of thing. This is something in between. This doesn't have a ton of wildlife value here, but it's better than nothing. I would add a little bit more. Now, this actually is my yard, an older photo of it, but you can accuse me of overplanting. Feel free. I'm trying to make up for everybody else who's not planting the right stuff. All I can tell you is the birds really appreciate what I'm doing, because I've got a really great yard list. Anyway, back to the verdin. Here's that little guy I was telling you about earlier in a little nest of the verdin. That's the one that likes the sweet acacia. Here's another view of another section of my yard. I just like variety. I go to the living desert and places like that for inspiration, or just look at other people's yards and see what I like, and I get, something like that and put it in there. I always can find a space for a new plant. Bewick's wren is one of our most common yard birds, in your yard too. And if you put up a little nest box like Lynn did, if it's got the right size hole, the Bewick's wren will move in. He doesn't care whether it's shaped like a cat or a trailer or whatever. Now that second birdhouse of Lynn's, that hole looked pretty big on that one. I don't know that the Bewick's wren's going to like that one. It's got to be really small. So we'll see what happens. You'll let us know at the next talk. But the thing about birdhouses that you buy on the shelf is you never know what you're going to get with that hole. And usually it's way too big for a lot of birds. Birds are smaller than you think. So they want the smallest hole possible because they feel safe inside, that the predators can't come in and get them. And if the hole's too big, then there's no safety there. A rat or anything could just climb right in and get them. So do a little research online and research what size diameter the hole should be for the bird you're trying to attract, if you're trying to attract a certain species to your yard. Or consult with me, and I'll be happy to set you straight. But the Bewick's wren, though, is a bird that will use a typical birdhouse that you might buy off the shelf somewhere. Cactus wren like to build their own nests in cactus, so you do need to supply them with a cactus foundation first, and then they will come. Sometimes they will nest in palm trees if you haven't over-pruned them. And I've got a cactus wren in my yard right here in Palm Desert. Oh, just some plants that should be part of the mix. Brittle bush is a great all general purpose native plant that'll attract a lot of good insects that birds eat, and butterflies and other things. Bladderpot is a fun plant to put in. It's a native to the area. It's pretty. It smells like black pepper. Desert lavender is another great addition to your yard. The native bees really love desert lavender, and it smells good. It smells like lavender. It's in the sage family. So these are just some plants that every native yard here probably should have at least one of. Cactus, if you like cactus, put them in the mix too. They'll bloom in the spring sometimes. They'll bloom in the fall. And they're beneficial for native insects and other things, and they just look nice as well. And if they're big enough, the big tall ones, then the cactus wren can use them too. Unfortunately, we just lost a great place to buy plants, and that's the Living Desert. They closed their native plant nursery there. So you no longer can purchase plants at the Living Desert, which I think is a real shame. So they took away that option for us. So now we're left, we got molars over here, which isn't too bad, but you got to make sure you get the native stuff. And also Cactus Mart up in Morongo Valley is still a good place to buy native plants. Green Desert? Where's that? Okay. Yeah, okay, so that sounds good. Bermuda Dunes, Green Desert. So bees. We're going to talk about bees because they're part of the mix too. You want them to pollinate your native plants. Now, it turns out that European honeybees, which are not native, they were imported back in the 1600s to the United States, aren't the world's greatest pollinators. They're just a generalist when it comes to pollination. They pollinate our crops, and so farmers utilize honeybees for pollination services, but they're not real good at pollinating our native plants. So if we want our native plants to thrive in our yards, we need to encourage other kinds of bees besides European honeybees and the Africanized honeybees, which look exactly alike, by the way. And we can do that by providing native plants and providing bee houses, which I'll show you. You can see the honeybee, though. He's gathering pollen on his hind legs there. He's got these pollen baskets, and that's where he stores all the pollen. And you can see that big yellow blob there of pollen that female bee has gathered and is going to bring back to the hive. They'll make bee bread out of it, and they'll feed their larvae with it. Now, here's a bee house. This is in my yard. It's just a big piece of 4x6 lumber, untreated wood. That's kind of important. And I drill holes in the side of it, in the long end of it. I don't drill all the way through. And this provides nesting cavities for native bees to lay their eggs in. So the native bees will fly into those holes. They'll lay an egg. They'll put a little bee bread in there, and they'll seal it off, and they'll fill that whole chamber with eggs and food until it's all filled up. So you have a whole tube full of eggs and food for the young. And then they'll seal it off on the outside, and then you'll know it's filled up. So you can see some of them are sealed. Some of them have been used already. And these are some of the bees that might use your bee houses if you put them out there. Leafcutter bees are one. So if you've noticed little chunks missing in some of your leaves in your garden, that's the work of the leafcutter bee, because it likes to line its holes with leaves, make a soft little lining for its young. Carpenter bees are larger bees. They prefer to make their own holes and chew their own holes in old agave stalks, for example. So if you've got an agave stalk that's finished blooming, or maybe your neighbor has one, they're going to throw it away, go grab that thing and put it up in your yard like a flagpole. And not only will it be a great place for birds to perch, but it also can be a great place for carpenter bees to lay their eggs in. So I'm always looking for agave stalks if you want to bring some by to my yard. We'll talk more about bee houses in a minute. If you want to attract butterflies to your yard, it's important to know about the food plants. Now, there's a difference between food plants and nectaring plants. The nectaring plants are just the things that they're going to get a sip of nectar from, just to keep them going. And that can be almost any flower, but especially the more open ones for the butterflies. But the food plants are the ones they're actually going to lay their eggs on, and so those are even more important than the flowering nectaring plants. So, for instance, monarchs, as you might know, only lay their eggs on milkweed. And monarchs are not doing well at all. Last year was the worst count ever for monarchs. So they're at at their all-time low right now, and they really, really need our help at this time. Climate change isn't helping them either. And so do your part, and please plant milkweed whenever you can. Always try to plant the native milkweed, the milkweed that's native to your area, if you can find it. Get as much of it as you can and put it in your yard. And if you have to plant non-native milkweed, it's better than nothing, but you got to make sure you cut it back in the winter. So it's important to cut back the non-native stuff in the winter. But if you plant milkweed, the monarchs and the queens will come and use it and lay their eggs on it. And it's fun to watch that. Great purple hairstreak, actually, the food plant is mistletoe. So remember the Phainopeplas bird? The great purple hairstreak will also hang out near that mistletoe because that's the only thing it lays its eggs on. If you live in some of the cove areas, you know, Rancho Mirage Cove or La Quinta Cove or Desert Hot Springs, you may have yucca moths coming to your porch light at night because they're associated with Joshua trees and other species of yucca that grow more in the cove communities. These little white moths. And they're the only pollinator of these yucca plants, so they're really important to have around. I could do a whole talk just on that. Bats. Now, all of our bats, do you know that next week is Bat Week, by the way? So there's a whole bunch of bat things going on next week. Maybe you've seen the signs around town. It's Bat Week. So there's going to be some lectures and some outings and whatnot, so watch for that. But all of our bats here in the Coachella Valley are insect-eating bats. And a bat can eat 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 mosquitoes in one night. So if you're worried about things like Zika virus and other things being spread by mosquitoes, we should want to encourage bats in every way that we can, because all of our bats are here to help. Now, these two bats here pictured are nectar-eating bats, so they have an association with cactus. So you'd see these guys over in Arizona, not so much here in the Coachella Valley. Like I said, all of our bats are the insect-eating type, and we have one bat, my favorite, this one on the lower right, called the pallid bat, which actually specializes in eating centipedes and scorpions, which it scoops right off the ground. So we got a lot of cool bats in the area. They get a bad reputation, and they shouldn't. Talk a little bit about palms. I mean, a palm tree can be a whole ecosystem in itself if you leave it alone and don't hack it to death, because it can form that beautiful skirt, especially if you plant the native fan palm. So if you're planting palms, ask for the Washingtonia foliifera, the California fan palm. The Washingtonia robusta, which is the one on the left, the Mexican fan palm, is not native to the area. But the Washingtonia foliifera retains its skirt. It doesn't fall off in the wind usually. So it can last its whole lifetime with that skirt on, if you don't cut it off, that is. And so that one on the right is a Washingtonia foliifera. And inside that skirt, all kinds of birds and useful critters can live, including a species of bat called the yellow bat, which specializes in living inside those palm fronds. As I mentioned before, the Orioles will nest, they'll weave their nest on the palm fronds on the back side of it, so you don't even see it, but it's there, and they like the fronds that are kind of half green and half dead, the ones that we love to cut off. So if they are pruning palms in the place where you live, at the very least, you know, give wildlife a break and give these Orioles a break, and don't prune during the nesting season, because you could very easily be cutting out those active nests and not even realize it. So you really want to avoid the period from about March 1st to July 1st. So that's March, April, May, and June. Those are 4 months you really want to avoid doing the palm cutting. And unfortunately, a lot of palm trimming is done during those times. In the summer, when people are bored or have nothing else to do, they start hacking the palms. So, you know, do your part and be aware and try to at least push that pruning to a non-nesting time of year. Kestrels will nest in the palms. They're great to have around. They eat mice and all kinds of insects and things. Barn owls are great to have around. They'll nest in the palms. They eat rats. They could eat 2 or 3 rats a night. So you want to encourage them to be around. The Orioles are great to have around. And the great horned owls too. Yeah. Giving it a haircut on the bottom like they do over in Palm Springs. I've seen at Palm Springs they do that. They don't cut the fronds off, but they just kind of trim the bottom. Yeah, it's better than not cutting the frond off, yeah. So that won't hurt as much. But, if you can, just let it be wild. I mean, that's what nature intended. In fact, if you go to the Coachella Valley Preserve or the Indian Canyons, you can remind yourself what a palm is supposed to look like. And you'll often see the skirt coming all the way down to the ground and touching the ground and forming kind of a tent on the ground too, which can house gray foxes and ringtails and all kinds of other critters too, bobcats. So if you're cutting the palms even a little bit just to trim them, again, you're losing that benefit as well. So I'd say just trim them as little as possible or not at all, and definitely avoid the nesting period. You can always email me and consult me if you forget these things, and I'll help talk you through it. If you can put a brush pile in like I've done in my backyard, it can be a real focal point for a lot of birds, and they love to dive into this brush pile when the Cooper's hawk dives on them. And they feel safe, and it gives them a nice little refuge. So brush pile, if your CCNRs allow it, do it. And if they don't, then put it in an area where they can't see, like in the back corner, So you do the things in the front yard that appease the CCNR folks driving by, and in the backyard's where you go crazy, right? Say's phoebes will nest sometimes on your light fixtures or under the eaves of your house. You may have seen this bird around. He's a year-round resident. They like the more drier, open areas, the more the xeriscape kind of a yard. Other critters may benefit from your yard. It's not just birds. We do have kangaroo rats around at night. They're fun to see, and although raccoons aren't really a desert species, they have moved into the area, so they do occur here. And you might see them. The Cooper's hawk is the hawk that patrols your yard and likes to eat small birds and mourning doves and things like that. So if you're wondering, what's that hawk that's always dive bombing on my bird feeders? This is your answer right here. 9 times out of 10 or more, it's the Cooper's hawk. They're very maneuverable, they're very fast, and so they patrol your yard looking for something to eat. And that's just part of the whole ecosystem. They eat a few small birds, and that's just what they do. Cooper's hawk. They're year-round residents. I've got a few desert tortoises in my backyard. I guess that's why I threw this in there. But our tortoises, of course, are rescues. We got them from the living desert. You need special permission to keep a desert tortoise because it is a threatened species in the wild. It's also the official state reptile of California, if you didn't know. But if you're interested in adopting a tortoise, you can contact the Living Desert or the Turtle and Tortoise Club, or contact me, and I can put you in touch with those people. Just keep in mind that they're going to live 50, 60 years or so. So you want to make sure you put them in your will and that they're well taken care of when you're gone. My kids already know they're going to be taking care of our tortoises because they're certainly going to outlive us. But they hibernate, or brumate is the proper word, for about 6 months of the year. So about this time, actually, right around Halloween is when they go under for the winter. And then we don't see them again until like end of March or in April. That's my kind of pet. You can just ignore it for 6 months and forget about it. Yeah, these are just some scenes from my backyard. I've got drippers and feeders and bat houses and bird houses and bee houses, and just it's just variety, something for everybody. Water is a key component to backyard wildlife habitat, and we want to conserve water, we want to save water, we don't want to waste water, but you need some kind of water feature if you want to really attract wildlife and increase the kinds of birds that are going to come to your yard. And a dripping water situation is the best. So if you can invest in one of these little water drippers that you can hook up to your hose, you can just tune it so it just drips very slightly, drip, drip, drip. Not a fast drip, but a slow drip is all you need. And in this case, I've got it dripping into a bird bath up high. When that fills up, it spills into another bird bath down low, so I'm kind of getting double use out of my water. Fills 2 different bird baths until it finally spills over and helps water some plants that are planted beneath that. So we're trying not to waste water, but it provides a really great attractant to birds. A lot of birds won't come to your bird bath if it's just still water, and a lot of bird baths are way too deep. So make them shallower by adding some thin rocks to it if you can, because birds won't go into bird baths if the water's deeper than their legs are long. So they want something really, really shallow. It's hard to find a good shallow bird bath. And they can't resist a drip. Something about dripping water just drives them crazy and attracts them. So you'll get all kinds of birds you've never seen in your yard before if you add a dripper to it, is what I'm trying to say. You'll probably double the number of species that come to your yard if you add the dripper compared to not having it. Black Phoebe loves water too, so he'll be hanging around your dripper, that's for sure. He's a year-round resident. This is just showing you some different things, ways to feed. You can put out suet, especially in the winter when it doesn't melt, and that will attract woodpeckers and finches and other things that will peck at it. Thistle seed is what you see in the middle slide there, and that attracts the goldfinches. They're the only ones with bills thin enough to extract those seeds. A platform feeder is kind of nice too. Some birds like to feed out in the open like that. Mix it up. Here's our most common goldfinch, the lesser goldfinch. And here's an Oriole feeder and a hummingbird feeder. So it's the same nectar in there, 4 parts water, 1 part sugar, 4 to 1. But the Oriole feeder has perches that are sized better for an Oriole to feed on. And the hummingbirds can also use the Oriole feeders because they kind of do 2 in 1. The hummingbird feeder on the right there, the Orioles will try to feed on it, but they kind of hang on the side and they end up spilling the juice all over the place, and it's just a mess. You don't use the red dye, so please don't use red dye or use any mixes with the red dye already in it. It's not necessary. It's not good for the birds. You don't need it, period. So just use ordinary white table sugar. That's the best. Don't use brown sugar. Don't use honey. Don't use raw sugar. It turns out that the white refined sugar is the closest thing to what they want. So 4 parts water to 1 part sugar. You can boil the water if you have time to. Personally, I don't. Or just use hot tap water. Hot tap water and dissolve it that way. No, it doesn't tip when the Oriole comes. The perches are set far enough out and they're sturdy enough and it's weighted enough and it's centered right. It's a little wider. So it's made for Orioles. I got one right here. I got a couple for sale if people want to get them at the end. Again, it's just some of the plants you're going to want to put in your yards. If you pick just one plant for hummingbirds, pick the tuberosa. I mean, it literally means hummingbird in Spanish, and it's the #1 plant for attracting hummingbirds in a natural way around here. And it's pretty to look at and will bloom most of the year. Tuberosa. And anything in the penstemon group, anything that's tubular and reddish or pinkish will attract hummingbirds, of course. Sages. And we already talked about the Costas hummingbird, but this is the one I have the most of in my yard. Almost all my hummingbirds are Costas. The females are kind of plain, upper right, and the males have a purple gorget. The Annas, I have a couple of these in my yard, but not many. But they're pretty common around town. You can see they're a little greener on the front. They have more of a reddish gorget, and it doesn't extend out quite as far as the Costas does. Let's go back to the Costas so you can see the difference. See how far out that gorget extends and how purple it is, kind of a grape purple. And very little greenish on the belly, just a little bit, but it's more white. And here you see more green on the belly, almost a speckling pattern. The gorget doesn't extend out, and it's not a grape purple, it's more of a wine red. Anna's hummingbird. So learn those two. Beneficial insects, you've heard about ladybugs that eat aphids, and they're always good to encourage. Lacewings also eat a lot of aphids. So, we don't want to spray pesticides in our yards if you can avoid it, because you'll kill some of these beneficial insects. I've got a little dust bath in the backyard. The quail and other birds like to take dust baths there. So I've kind of cordoned that off for them. And I'll rake it and I'll sift it with my little cat litter spoon and get it all nice and fluffy and powdery for them, and the birds appreciate that. You don't have to go to those extremes, but I do. But just having an area that you keep open with dirt is a good way to help the birds, because they just like that. They like to take dust baths. You don't have to cover everything over with grass or something else. We've already talked about the quail, Gamble's quail. A rock wall. So I have this little border between myself and my neighbor, and I made sure it was not mortared, because I wanted there to be nooks and crannies and spaces in between it. And the lizards just thrive in this thing. I mean, it's a lizard condominium, and it's just full of lizards. Even this morning, I got a roadrunner living in my yard, and even this morning he was cruising the top of the rock wall back and forth. He knows if he does that enough times, he'll be able to snatch breakfast. So it's just part of the whole thing. These are some of the lizard residents of the area. I don't have chuckwallas in my wall. I wish I did. But I've got the other guys. And there's the roadrunner I was just talking about. Now I feed him mealworms. And so roadrunners are fun to see and very tameable, but don't feed them hamburger balls, People do. So I'm just saying, if you know somebody or you're doing it, I'd say stop doing it. It's not good for them. It's junk food. They get metabolic bone disease. Their feet get all crunkled up and they can't run, and then they teach their young to beg for hamburger too. It's just not good. So don't do that. If you want to feed roadrunners, you can feed them whole mice, which you can buy at the pet store, already dead and frozen. Just keep them in your freezer and then thaw them out and put them on a rock every morning. That's perfectly okay. I give you the okay for that. If that's not your thing, there's nothing wrong with feeding them a few mealworms. And you can either buy the live squiggly ones and keep them in a tub in your fridge, or if you don't like that, you can buy the freeze-dried ones, which are easy to handle, and you don't have to refrigerate them or anything. They're freeze-dried mealworms, which are just beetle larvae, and you can put a handful of those on the rock, and that's not going to hurt the roadrunners to eat a few of those, if you have to feed them. Otherwise, just let them eat lizards and things on their own. But don't feed them hamburger, that's all. Please don't do that. Mockingbirds are very territorial, and will chase you and your cat and other mockingbirds, and so you'll see this white flashes around. They love berries. So they like pyracantha, which is not a native plant, but it is commonly planted in some yards around town. So if you have pyracantha or something with a berry on it, the mockingbirds will come to that. Grackles like lawns. So, if you have a lot of turf grass, you might have grackles. I don't have grackles in my yard, fortunately, because I don't have any turf grass. Mourning doves are everywhere. And they're really easy to catch from the Cooper's hawk, so, he can catch all he wants because there's plenty of them around. This is also the official city bird of Palm Desert, where I live, by the way. Does Rancho Mirage have a city bird yet? If you do, don't choose the mourning dove. That was a lousy choice of ours. I would suggest the cactus wren. Now, the common ground dove is not common at all. In fact, it's declining. Kind of looks like a baby mourning dove, but be on the lookout for these guys. If you see them, you should report them to eBird, ebird.org. So go online, ebird.org, and that's where you can report all your bird sightings. We're trying to figure out what the status is of common ground doves around here, because they really have been disappearing. We already talked a little bit about the Bell's vireo and its love of the stream side and the cottonwoods and the willows. And another bird that loves cottonwoods and willows is the yellow warbler. And the first tree I planted in my yard 23 years ago was a cottonwood tree. And sure enough, it attracted yellow warblers, which stopped their in migration now. So if you plant the right kind of plants, these birds will figure it out and they'll come to your yard. They really will. And they'll stop there. Woodpeckers, of course, like trees. The bigger the better. Our resident woodpecker is the one on the right, the ladder-backed woodpecker. And we're getting more and more reports of Nuttall's woodpeckers now coming down from the mountains and showing up in places like the Living Desert before they chopped away all their cottonwood trees. And the Wild Bird Center in Indio has Nuttall's woodpeckers sometimes. Something to watch out for. And again, you can certify your habitat. You have to fill out a form. You should try to avoid pesticides. I've mentioned that already. Maybe section off an area that's your special pollinator garden. You can plant special plants specifically to attract pollinators, or just put them throughout your yard. But we got to support monarch butterflies too, which are really declining. And again, it's all about the food, the water, and the shelter. Food, water, and shelter. Butterflies like the open-faced flowers, aster family, or get butterfly bush if you can find it. It's hard to find that one sometimes, but if you see it, buy it. And the bees, the native bees, like things in the shades of blue and purple. Because remember, these insects are seen in ultraviolet. They see differently than we do. And so this really shows up strongly in a bee's eyes. So they're looking for purples and blues. And carpenter bees love orange jubilee and Tacoma stands, the yellow ones. So plant those two for the carpenter bees, which are good to have around as well. They're native, and they're non-aggressive. All of our native bees are non-aggressive. And like I said, don't forget the food plants. So do a little research on the food plants of your favorite butterflies that you might be trying to attract. Plant those, and the butterflies will come. Giant swallowtails, for example, feed on citrus. So if you have citrus in your yard, and a lot of us do, you'll have giant swallowtails like the one on the lower right hanging around. Blues like salt bushes. And if you have cats, keep them indoors, please, because they kill billions of birds unnecessarily every year for no reason. And if they must go outside, like my cat Wally, then make sure he's got 2 bells on his collar, because 1 bell is not enough. Those cats are just too smart. And that at least gives the birds a fighting chance, because they'll hear that bell before they strike. But anyway, keep them indoors. That's the best thing.